Let me cover what we're going to go over today, and then Peter and I will take a minute and introduce ourselves. So basically, I'm not going to reread each objective, but I'm going to talk about looking at the whole approach to M&A, and both from the due diligence perspective and all the way through integration and what we might consider stabilization. Want you to look at that process entirely different, and hopefully we'll provide you some tips and some wisdoms and some cautions as we go through this. We will take some time to compare the more commonly accepted traditional approach to post-deal integration to looking at it differently, and hopefully you'll gain some tips and things to consider as you practice moving forward. The flow for our time together today is essentially, sorry, took that out. The flow will match the objectives. And Peter, you want to introduce yourself? Obviously, you're much better looking in person, just like I am, but maybe you can say something about who you are.
Thanks for a wonderful introduction, Mark. Hi everybody, Peter Turgoose. Good to see some familiar faces in the audience, particularly good to see so many people who've come over from the EODF and the EDOF alumni in there, so great to see you. I'm Peter Turgoose. You can see on there my background's in psychology. I've done internal and external organisation design roles. I've been with OTM for, well, since 2010. But actually first met Mark and first met OTM about 15 years before that, when we brought Mark and his team in to help us with a major redesign of the company I was working with at the time. So yeah, really looking forward to talking to you for the next hour. I'm just looking at that photograph. It's good to remember what life was like when hairdressers were open. I'm wearing headphones. For those of you who don't know, in the UK we haven't had hairdressers open since it must be, well, it was well before Christmas. So I'm desperately in need of a haircut at the moment. Enough about me anyway, Mark.
Gosh, I don't know where to go with that, Peter, but I'll let that slide for now. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Hi, everyone. I started on the mark over 30 years ago, 31 years ago. So I'm delighted that we're still in business and still relevant. My first redesign experience was in 1987. Along with Peter and other teammates on the mark, we've completed close to 450 or just about 450 redesigns around the globe. We'll come back to that. Like Peter and other OTM team members, I serve on boards in our industry. We'll talk more a little bit about that in a second. And I have a master's degree in a type of clinical psychology on systems, human systems, and that'll also come into play a little bit later when we talk about our approach to M&A integration. I just gave you a little kind of a overview about On the Mark. We've been doing design work for a long time. There's not much we haven't seen in the design world, in the organization design or operating business model world. We've done it for every type of business function, business units, corporate, enterprise-wide, cross-industry. And one of the things, as you may know, some of you from EODF, there's a lot of training going on in organization design. Peter and I, along with OTM team members, we've trained thousands of people in our organization design solution and continue to do that according to the 10-20-70 model of development, which is really 10% is some kind of classroom or virtual experience, 20-70 is a combination of coaching, mentoring, support, real-time observation, real-time co-delivery together. So that's a little bit about On the Mark and where we've been around in terms of the globe. These are our solution sets. We're going to focus today on M&A and business integration, but it's also heavily peppered with organization design and accelerated change readiness. So with that, one last thing I want to highlight is that all of the On the Mark team contribute back to our industries, and you can see some of the icons that I have at the bottom of the slide here in terms of where we are board members or part of the conference planning committees, etc. So we take great pride in being part and giving back to our industry. One of the things I want to highlight is that On the Mark has a new partnership with Bowling Green State University's Executive Masters of Organization Development program. And we're totally excited about that. And it's reciprocal. And they are the oldest organization development program in the world, just an FYI. So we'll come back. Peter, anything you want to say about our contribution back?
No, I think you probably covered it all. One thing probably to mention, just for those people who aren't aware of it, there is a qualification in organisation design about which results in you becoming a certified organisation design professional. And Mark and I are both proud to be among the first people in the globe, across the globe, actually, to get that qualification.
Yeah, you're right about that. And that is through either the ODF, the ODC, or the EODF down in the bottom left there. So we can talk more about that. All right, let's move on. Peter, you want to take it from here? And then you can beep or just tell me when you want to change, Peter.
Yeah, no, it's for those of you who've been on webinars like this before with us, this is a change of role where I'm telling Mark what to do rather than he's telling me to change the slides.
Everyone should know that that's not true.
What I want to do is just do a little bit of scene setting and position M&As in terms of where it fits in business strategy and what's going on, what we can see going on across the globe at the moment. So if you flick to the next slide, Mark. So the amount of M&A activity has been moving up and down over the last few years, but there's a steady upward trend. What this slide's showing, and I'm not going to go through all the letters on it, but all the words on it, but this is looking particularly at alliances and joint ventures. And basically what we're seeing in that area is a continual growth. And I'll say a little bit in a few minutes about what's driving some of that growth. But with joint ventures, alliances, a continual growth, it's interesting to see the difference in the balance here, which is when it comes to JVs or joint ventures, much more of that is going on over China, Japan, that area of the globe, with less probably in Europe and the US. But when it comes to alliances, where companies are working together, we're seeing much more of the alliances happening in the US, and again less in the Indo-China area, and Europe sort of holding steady on sort of 15% across both of them. But just interesting to consider that balance of where JV work's happening and where alliances are happening. Push on to the next slide, which is about mergers, Mark. When we come to look at mergers, again, there was a bit of a dip early in 2020, which probably wouldn't surprise anybody. But if we look at the trend graph, once we had that early dip, as most countries in the world, I guess, were responding to COVID in their different ways. But we've seen a bounce back from that, and not only is the number of deals going up, but the size of the deals is going up, and that's happening across all geographies. So no matter where you are in the world, you're sitting in a geography where we're seeing a growth in M&A activity. And just push me on one more, Mark. And this is a slightly complicated slide. I could have reworked Bloomberg slides, but I thought that was probably a bit unfair given that they provided us with the data. But basically, for those of you who like looking at data, it is saying that M&A activity is increasing, and it's increasing more in the second half of 2020. We hopefully we'll see the first quarter 2021 data will come out soon, and we'll see where that's positioning us. But if you step back from that, and I feel lots of you have been reading the press, watching the press, and I know that because I saw a couple of people in the audience, that I know some of you are actually involved in M&A work at the moment. And certainly I can probably speak more for Europe than I can for the US, and Mark might add some colour later on as we go. But certainly what we're seeing a lot of in the UK and Europe at the moment is what were traditionally bricked bricks and mortars company starting to look to acquire other channels, particularly acquiring the online channels and building alliances with distribution and logistics companies. But interestingly, we're also seeing it happening the other way, where companies that have traditionally been online and have done quite well over the last 12 months are looking to move into high streets and move into bricks and mortar. Possibly because it's quite cheap, but because nobody's quite sure what's happening with the high street at the moment. But certainly in Europe, we're seeing a growth in M&A activity and a growth in what I would think of as alliance activity, as people are starting to build alliances and get much closer to logistics and distribution companies. If you move me on to the next slide, Mark.
Peter, before you go forward, if you don't mind, one of the alliances that has received a lot of play in the U.S. is the partnership between Merck and Johnson & Johnson to produce the vaccination. It's a good illustration of what the point you raised earlier about alliances in North America over Europe or the Pacific Rim. So,
so move on. I'll actually just building on that point. I'll talk to this slide in a second. I think the pharmaceutical companies are a great, and we won't go too deep into it, they're a good example of how alliances can work. And some of you may well have been to some of the pharmaceutical sites where they have their offices, particularly in Europe, and you'll find that they share sites. So when they have to work together, they know they have to work in an alliance, and they've got some of that down to a T, right down to the level of being co-located when they do need to work together. So they're a good model of looking at how things can work.
So
however,
it's the site that CSLB just opened up in Marburg. Right, it's a good example of that.
Yeah, where they share that with Novartis and
with
somebody else they share it with. But despite all that, the data does show us that M&As, there are successes, but there are failures. Is always a difficult word, I think, to use, because there's a difference, I think, between something failing, which suggests that nothing happened and it was a complete mess, as opposed to failing where it didn't achieve what people expected it to achieve in the first place, and that's where most definitions of failure come from. So you hear a lot of that. If you look at 83% fail, that sounds scary. Actually, what it's saying is 80% failed to create a sustainable advantage. So what that's saying is the merger or the acquisition happened, but over time, the advantage or the benefit that they expected to get from it decayed. Where the 66% fail, that's basically saying it didn't deliver the profitability that was expected when the deal was done. And the 60% destroying company value is basically saying, actually, we finished up less profitable as a result of the merger than we were beforehand.
Peter, before you go forward, Christina asked a question. Maybe you can address it. She was saying it's interesting to hear that M&As are still happening a lot. What is your observation on ecosystems and networked organizations based on partnerships, sometimes even without a big contract? Is that an alternative to M&A, and what are the different motivations? So if you can address it or not, we can. I'm thinking about it as well, but if you want to address it while we're going, you can.
I guess all I would say without, I need notes to that question to come with lots of examples, but I think what we're starting to see is, it depends how you define ecosystem, it depends how you define alliances, but certainly in Europe, where companies are starting to position themselves as wanting to form alliances with other companies. So the logistics companies, which traditionally and the whole logistics industry, which traditionally was, give us a ring, we'll pick up your parcel and we'll deliver it for you, or give us a ring and we'll pick up a lower load of parcels and we'll deliver it for you, have become much more vertically integrated with the organizations they work with. So they've changed their business model to a point where they can very quickly vertically integrate with anybody who wants to form an alliance with them.
So Peter, would that be an example of like Royal Mail Wholesale, where they deliver the last mile for a company or another post office from another country, or is that totally different?
I would think more of, I don't know, this might not work for America, but there's a company in the UK called Hermes, which is so they do a lot of Amazon returns. So, traditionally that would be, you ring them up and, or you take it down to a shop and they pick up the parcel, they deliver it to Amazon gets it, and then they deal with it, and eventually the customer who sent it back gets their refund. Now, because they've vertically integrated themselves with Amazon, the moment that, and I've had this experience myself, the moment the Hermes driver arrives at your door and scans it, I can't even get back to my computer fast enough to find out that I've got the refund. So they've integrated themselves right into Amazon systems to a point where Amazon are providing a excellent service for their customers, providing real value for their customers through that integration. And that's got to have been a deliberate operating model design on behalf of Hermes to be able to allow them to integrate with other companies. So that was what I was thinking of.
Yeah, and the thing I would add, Christina, to your question is, it's not just ecosystems, but it's also platforms. So companies, and as Peter talked about, is setting up common platforms so that they can more effectively be an extension of each other's business. So it's not just ecosystems. The whole thing about networked organizations, that has a lot of assumptions built in it. We'll come back to that as we go on down the line, but hopefully that was helpful. Go ahead, Peter, thanks.
Yeah, no, I'll keep going. So the right-hand side of the slide that you're looking at is really just results of a survey of companies who were asked, or executives that were asked, what's been the most important thing driving the success of your deals. You can see the data there, but the top two are well, the top one is having a well-integrated, a well-executed integration plan, which by definition assumes you've got a well-developed integration plan in the first place. Then having got the price right, having done the due diligence right, and the economic conditions in which the new entity is operating. So those are the top four reasons executives perceive that they get a good outcome from their M&A activity. If you move on one slide, Mark, when we look at it from an organisation design perspective, and when we're working with companies on M&A, the three factors that we see are causing or at the root cause of the deal not really delivering what was expected, that fits into three categories, and these are three areas that we'll cover in more detail as we go through the webinar. But I just want to signal them now. Oops, where have we gone? so that we can move through them. So the three factors that we're going to cover is in those companies where the deals are not successful, we see an absence of any fit assessment between the two companies. We see them having taken a fragmented approach to integration, and critically, we see that they push downstream, so they push till later any of the real integration work. So a lot of this is all about integration, and I'll just do a little bit about positioning integration, and then hand over to Mark to start talking about some of the things that we from OTM do to help companies address and deliver an effective integration and effective integration strategy. So next slide, Mark. I'll move through the so let me just say a little bit about what the integration strategy is. If you look at the deals that are done, they fit really into five categories. I'm not going to read all the words on there, but it is all about the extent to which the acquiring company has to change and the extent to which the acquired company has to change. So if you move from the bottom left, where the strategy has been to keep the acquired company completely separate from the acquiring company. So it's about preserving that company as it is, right through to the top right, which is about where a strategy about transforming both companies so that the new entity is a transformation from the base that both the acquired and the acquiring company started from. Flip the slide, Mark. So what we see, what we see is that after those 5 strategic options, 4 out of the 5, just move the slide on a little bit more, thanks. 4 out of the 5 of these options require a degree of organizational redesign work. So it requires the companies to be integrated in some form or another. And the moment you get to that point, that's starting to tell you that you've got to look at this as a holistic redesign effort and not a fragmented approach to bringing the companies together. So we're going to hand over to Mark, who will talk about the first step of this, and where I talked about fit assessment. Mark will now go into a bit more detail on that. The floor is yours.
Yeah, Peter, will you just kind of keep an eye on the Q&A in the chat? Let me know as we go.
Yeah, I will do.
All right, great. I do want to say a couple things before I get off this slide. Is that if we were to take some of these integration strategies and we were to overlay it on the economic climate over years, where companies go through boom periods and then go through cost-cutting periods because they need to be more efficient, and then they go through growth periods and they go through downsizing or cost-cutting experiences because demand changes. We've all seen that cycle. One of the things that happens is if you take a preservation kind of bolt-on approach to M&A and you say, oh, we'll get to it over time, what we end up seeing in organizations that many times we're called in to do organization design work is what they've done is they've acquired companies over time, have taken a preservation approach to their integration strategy and never truly integrated them. And what it's done is perverted their operating model to the point of driving a significant amount of cost and complication into their operating models. And so the warning here is, it's one thing to do a preservation or a bolt-on, but what you don't want to do is you want to do it like we'll integrate over 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, we'll do it over time, because you run the risk of the climate and the demand changing for your business, and then you forget about it because something else is more appealing. And so it's important in terms of calling that out as a watch out. So let's talk about due diligence and fit predictor. What I share with you here is a kind of what we consider a typical M&A process, where there's consideration to acquire a potential acquiree, and some due diligence is done, some integration model and planning, implementation, and then post-integration, where you're basically hopefully business as usual. In the typical due diligence piece of work, we're proposing that you do more than what's done today. What's done today is your typical legal and financial driven kind of view of things, your risk assessment, your deal synergies. What we're proposing is that you also do in the due diligence phase is something we call the comprehensive fit predictor. Now, this is a tool we developed and have evolved since early 2000, and I'll talk a little bit about what that entails. The fit predictor, I'm going to go back here and notice that the STAR model has kind of been on every slide, and the fit predictor is set up exactly like the STAR model. And basically what it does is it does an assessment of both the strategic and operational fit of the acquirer and the acquiree. And what it does is it looks at business direction, work streams, or the work that creates value for customers, how companies are set up, how they manage their businesses, including technology, what are their HR processes, culture, and ways of working. Now, you're probably thinking now as well, we don't always have that kind of access to a company. particularly if one that we're interested in acquiring. Well, let me share with you a use case that might be useful. It was in 1999, I did acquisition integration work for a nationwide bakery, and they were acquiring a regional bakery and wanted to expand that regional business into their global business. And so what we did is we did a significant amount of mystery shopping to get a sense of operationally what was the customer experience like, how did they deliver their services, and we could extrapolate quite a bit of operational information from all the different mystery work that we did. In other words, the potential target, the acquiree, was totally unaware of the reconnaissance that we were doing to predict some kind of fit. And it's not always so much the strategic fit that gets in the way, but it's the operational fit. It's the day-to-day work, how we're set up, how we do business. Let me be quiet there for just a second. Peter, are there any questions or comments that I should just be aware of before I move?
No, there was one question, but I answered it by typing the answer in. So,
okay, great.
Okay.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let's keep moving. So one of the things is this doesn't have to take long, but what it does is you think about it as an input into a really good integration strategy, right? So this is doing our fit predictor early on in the due diligence phase really establishes some reality-based, what's it going to take to integrate, given the integration strategy that we prefer to target, as Peter talked about those 5 positions. Go ahead, Peter, or is this me?
No, I'll do a couple of slides and then I'll give it back to you. So let's put a bit more flavour behind what Mark said earlier about the traditional approach to M&A. So due diligence, as Mark said, is normally legally and financially driven. It's about a risk assessment, and it's about identifying where the acquiring company is going to extract value by integrating the acquired company into its operating model. And that normally then leads to a fragmented plan of different work streams of activity to I guess what is normally referred to as integrating the 2 companies, but actually isn't integrating the 2 companies. So a plan is developed, which is more often than not a lot about the technical aspects of the change, and then this is implemented. Errors occur or things go wrong, and they're fixed as they go, or they're never fixed. So if you move on to the next slide for me, Mark. So if we look at that, you're gonna have to keep pressing the button. Just press it a few times. Sorry, it's a slide that builds. If we look at what tends to be going on in the fragmented approach to a redesign, there's a waterfall workstream plan to integrate the 2 companies, but what it does is takes each element and tries to plan it and integrate it separately. So you will almost always see, as part of that plan, somebody will get the job of putting together a plan to onboard the top management. The systems people will be given a target of moving the data across and integrating the data. HR is probably given the job of integrating the payroll. It's quite likely that somebody will say, "Oh, we better align the cultures in the company," or we better make sure we're working to a single culture. And often we'll finish it with the dreaded culture change program. There'll probably be some work on employee engagement, because it's obviously seen to be a good thing to have engaged employees. Finance normally is given the job of at least tracking and driving the synergy capture, and synergy capture is often seen as extracting financial value from the merger or from the acquisition. And then somebody else will say, actually, we need to do a bit of organisation design work, which when they say that, they mean we need to move some people around on the organisation chart. So if you there are probably other work streams going on, and we've seen this where we've been brought in post deal and post early work, where companies have said, we've tried to integrate and it hasn't happened. And what we often find is that there are a whole series of work streams that have gone on. If you look at those work streams through an organisation or an operating model lens, and then obviously the operating model lens we're using here is the OTM applied STAR model, you'll see that each work stream is addressing one or 2 points of the operating model. So onboarding is probably addressing management mechanisms, it might be changing people processes. Cultural alignment is probably affecting people and is trying to affect the outcome of the overall design by changing the culture. Organisation design, in the way that it's being described, is a work stream that's probably addressing the structure, because it's about moving people around. In the eyes of the people who set the work stream, it's about moving people around on the organisation chart. But what it leads to is a whole series of changes being driven into the organisation, which are not integrated, often clash with each other, often fail to deliver value. In the worst cases, start to destroy value, and result in a social system, the people in the organisation often being unclear or confused about what's expected of them and what change is going to happen next. So in the OTM approach, we're looking at using the principles that we know from organisation design and looking at an operating model holistically to take a much more integrated approach to build on the fit predictor data to start to plan how the integration will happen. And I'll hand
Peter, before you,
I was going to hand over to you, Mark. So
yeah, great. Before you close up there, sorry to step on you there verbally. Didn't mean that. One of the things, if you look at this slide, is telling is the number one rule of the applied STAR model is business direction or form follows function, and all those elements on the left there, 1 through 7, are really part of the function, but are part of the form, and the function or the business direction should drive all those choices. And so when Peter talks about fit, we're not only talking about fit of how each part of the STAR fits together and reinforces and aligns, but the other piece is who ensures the competitive advantage, the business direction, and what the company is trying to do, and where is that in this waterfall, fragmented, overly functionalized approach to M&A work. And that's one of the big ahas and the big wisdoms that we have here is it's one thing just to integrate the oranges and the different icons here, but what are they integrating against and what are they ensuring fit against? And many times when a business acquires another business, it's not just adding 1 + 1 = 2, but many times it's changing the business direction or enhancing a strategic value proposition to their customers. So it's really important to think about business direction driving all the elements of integration, not just these 7 what we would call fragmented approaches. Thanks, Peter, for passing it off here.
Just before you move on, Mark, there's a question from Kevin, which you've probably half answered there without even knowing the question was coming, which is very clever. But Kevin says, you mentioned fit a lot. Given the failure statistics, how often do you see that executives don't really know their own strengths and strategy well enough prior to M&A? Know yourself before you assess fit. Question.
Yeah, do you want to address that? I mean, I'm happy to go as well. So again, Kevin, good to see you. Go ahead, Peter.
I think you've almost answered the question in the way, it was almost a rhetorical question, I think, Kevin. We often find that executives have not thought through what their future operating model is going to look like, and they really haven't thought through what their future value proposition is going to be. So without that real clarity around what the future value proposition is going to be post-integration, those of those of us that do organization design know that knowing and having real clarity around your value proposition is a fundamental driver of the decisions you make about your future operating model. And I think because they haven't thought through that value proposition completely clearly, it often leads to the fragmented approach, because they're not really thinking in an integrated way about how we're going to fit everything to that value proposition. I don't know if you'd add that, Mark.
Yeah, Kevin, I would answer it this way. 95% of the organization design projects that we do, that includes M&A as maybe part of the equation, they're not completely clear about their business direction, strategy, value proposition. And it comes down to they have strategy documents, but the problem is it doesn't say what they're going to do to who and what they're not going to do and to who. And there's no competitive difference, meaning how do we differentiate from everybody else and all of our competitors? So while they may have it, what we find, or have something, what we find is it's typically at minimum lacking in substance and lacking in differentiation and competitive difference. Anything you want to say about where's the integration to ensure fit, Peter? Or is that clear from here?
Yeah, and I think it's clear from here. I think you're next.
I'm next. All right, good. All right, so what we want you to think about is if you do the due diligence and you use not only the traditional approach to due diligence, but add the comprehensive fit predictor, then your integration model and planning becomes different because it becomes an input. The results of the fit predictor then establish for yourselves is what's it going to take truly to integrate this business, and is our integration strategy the right way to go about this? Again, giving you might think of the wisdom that we're applying across, and what we're asking you to do different is go slower to go faster during implementation and post-deal. Our approach to integrating, basically integrating M&A work with organization design is basically our cycle, our methodology is on the right-hand side there, and we use the star to focus on the work. So we start with what we call a current state review, which would be the similarity, would be similar to basically saying, this is the current operating model of the acquirer, and this is what we know about the acquiree. Then we go into the foundation phase, which establishes the future business direction, the requirements for the future operating model. And Peter alluded to it, or actually was very explicit about it in the last slide, is being really clear about what it is we're trying to create from the acquisition. One of the things I also want to kind of highlight, kind of some recent experiences, is adding similar services isn't just adding similar services, it changes the value proposition. Adding a different channel and delivering your services through a different channel isn't just about adding another channel. And so it's important that it's critical that you step back, that the acquirer steps back and says, what is it we're really trying to do with our business over the next 1, 3, 5 years? And by acquiring this acquiree, by bringing them in, how does that change our model, and how should our model be going forward? I think it's a step often missed. And then we're going to go through, and I'm going to show you where each of these phases, the concept design, detailed design, transition planning, how it aligns with the traditional approach to M&A work. And here it is. So if you look at the icons across the top, the due diligence phase, we basically say you do a current state review and you get as much information as you can about the acquirer, about the acquiree. And of course, you basically baseline the operating model of the acquirer as well. And you basically then say, okay, acquirer, what are we trying to do with our business? What is our future if we bring that company in? What are we trying to do? What does that look like? And really setting up a set of requirements for the future operating model, which is the icon over integration model and planning. Then begins your concept design, detailed design, and transition planning. All happens in the implementation phase, which is akin to integration. And then the last phase, which you see there in yellow, the post-deal is basically implementation and governing the design, and that includes continuous improvement and making the changes as time goes on. But it's just an extension of the design process, but in more business as usual and day-to-day operations. So this is how our design cycle overlays over the course of a traditional M&A approach. Peter, anything you want to add here?
I won't add anything. We've got a question from Diana in due diligence. What if the intention is revenue growing rather than cost saving? I think my answer to that, Diana, is it is rare. It is rare that in an M&A they're looking to acquire a company in order to save cost. They might be expecting to take some cost out as they integrate the two companies, but more often, and you need to be aware of that. So you need to be, as you're doing the design and the integration work, you need to be aware of what the strategic objectives are in relation to changes to the cost base. But what's much more important is what Mark's just been talking about and what we alluded to earlier, is being really clear what the strategic intent of the future organization is. So there's a danger with one of the dangers with M&As is that leaders get tangled up in trying to deliver the short-term objectives, which might be to integrate systems, it might be to take some cost out, and that's why you finish it with a work stream approach. And the big difference that we're trying to illustrate here is to start with the end in mind. So far too often, M&A activity and M&A planning is all about delivering a series of milestones that people are looking at and where they are going forwards. And when we're working with companies, we spend a lot of time helping them really think through what the end state operating model needs to look like, what it's delivering for its customers, what its social system and its culture is going to look like. Now, on that journey, in that transition, there may be a need to remove some costs from the overall system, but that is a transition activity, not an end state activity. So we think of those two things differently. So you've talked about an intention to grow revenue. That is an end state where revenue is on a different trajectory. Taking cost out is a transition activity which you need to do to get the full synergy out of the deal. I don't know if you'd add to that, Mark.
Yeah, you know what? There's a couple things I want to say, Diana. It's a good question. I think of acquisition. The intent to acquisition is either to defend, or think of it as defense or offense, right? And you can do both simultaneously. It could be to defend market share and also then to expand, or as you use the word, grow. But I am thinking of the whole thing around cost that I want to highlight. So Peter and I did a 8-month project for an electronic manufacturing global company, and they had grown through acquisition. So this is the classic path that many companies take. They've grown through acquisition and they just bolted on, and where it made sense. And they did all the things that you do in traditional integration and implementation without having a systemic view. I think their operating costs, and I'm going from memory, so it'll be a ballpark. I think their annual operating costs were in the $700-800 million per year. And I believe that when we were done doing the due diligence and the foundation work, we had identified there were legacy structures and mechanisms and work being done throughout the organization that caused a lot of duplication, waste, errors, complication, delays, all the things that you think about when you think of waste, that actually total up over 100 million worth of just effort and time. So if you start to get a sense of cost, the cost of doing this poorly, and the cost of doing it in a fragmented, functionalized way can actually pay out or actually cipher off lots of money over the course of years. And the company that I'm thinking about is a really good example. It's got nothing to do with taking out costs, but what I am saying is that as you acquire, and if you don't do it, and if you don't get on it and think of what is the operating model we're aiming for, and then everything goes towards that, then what happens is you find yourself 3, 4, 5 years down the road at a time when the market turns going, oh my gosh, we got all this craziness in our organization. We need to fix that now. And what we're saying is avoid that. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded. There's a comment there coming in, Peter, in the chat. Before I move forward, you want to see if you want to address that?
Yeah, hi, where does cultural due diligence fit? When and how do you conduct cultural due diligence?
I'm going to go back to the STAR model here, Peter. Maybe you can talk to this because I think it fits nicely with this slide.
There's that. I've missed who asked the question. I think it was you, Dawn. What you're doing at the due diligence fair is you are doing a current state of the culture within the organisation. So you are looking at what the how the current social system operates in both organisations. So it isn't just about looking at the acquired organisation; it's looking at the acquiring organisation as well, because you are looking at you do need to look at the delta between the two at a point where you do start to do the foundation work and the design work. So it is, I mean, being simple about the answer, we don't look at culture as a separate entity. Culture is an output of the operating model. So the culture, you've got the culture you've got because of the way you put the operating model together. So we look at the drivers of the culture, which are the points of the star, but we also do look at some of the attributes of the current social system.
Yeah. So what I would say is culture, and I think it's worth repeating. Culture is an output of design, I am of the belief and of the practice that you can't change culture by putting in programs. That is an outcome of design. So culture and social attributes and ways of working and behaviors that we want in the organization are defined in the foundation phase, which is, if you'll notice over there, is in the position of about 3 o'clock on the cycle. That's where you establish the requirements. Then the process of the cultural attributes is put in motion through the design process. That's a social science term called design compatibility, which is basically the process of redesign, or the process of integration, post-deal integration, should mirror the social attributes and culture that you want on fire at the end of the design. So for us, it's not a work stream. For us, it's embedded in how all of the integration work is done, and it's addressed throughout every element of the star. So I'm going to keep us going, Peter. This is yours, Peter.
Is it? Oh, okay. Can you build it again for me, Mark? Sorry. Does it build?
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. So what we're starting to do now is to pull together the threads that we've laid so far. And we've talked a lot about the traditional approach to M&A being a waterfall approach that doesn't integrate sufficiently across the work streams that are put in place, and particularly tends to focus very much on the technical aspects of the integration, and focuses much less on readying people in the new organisation for the change that's going to come. So our approach, we've talked quite a lot about about the current state and the due diligence. We take a much more agile sprint approach to each of the phases of the design work. So and that gives us the opportunity to involve more people in that work, and have them using the foundation work and then the concept work, and then getting more and more people involved in the design work, using that as an opportunity to bring more people, to involve more people in the organisation, and to think at the same time about how all the points of the star are going to be brought together, and ensuring that we've got a fit in the new organisation, in the new operating model as we start to implement it. So if you step back and look at what's going on, if you're taking a fully integrated and a fully holistic approach to the integration of the two companies post-deal, you're doing that in a way that brings the people together and involves them in working on delivering everything that needs to be delivered to get to the end state that you're aiming for. So, do you want to add anything on that slide before I move on, Mark?
Before you do that, Peter, one of our attendees, Canal, asked a question, and let me just read it out to you there before we move on, so we can, let's see here. Question is, what if a big company acquires a startup which is operating with a very different model, ways of working, culture, would fail quickly if adopting the big company systems and processes? Do you have a view on that? They're asking, would you still run the OTM model, or something different?
Without having a bit more detail, it's difficult to answer. I think if you're buying a company for a specific capability, or specific, it's normally a specific capability, and that company is operating completely differently to the company that's a big acquiring company. And that might be a case for if we go back, if you think about the slide that I put on earlier on, it might be a case for the bottom left of that picture, where you decide that actually preservation and putting a ring fence around that company, the acquired company, is the right thing to do at the moment, because there is lots of evidence that when a large conglomerate buys a very small startup, it can kill it overnight, because the clash of culture and the changes to ways of working destroy the thing that helps that small company's operating model operate. So what will often be the case, I can certainly think of one big example that I know of where Nortel, that some of you may know, and they're gone now, but where Nortel acquired a very small company, they chose to keep it completely separate. They did have an integration strategy, but the implementation of that integration strategy didn't begin for 3 years, because they knew that they needed the capability and the product that was coming out of the acquired company. That was what they were spending their money on. So they left them and ring fenced them. So I think it is important when you do the due diligence work, and why we stressed earlier on, to think through what your integration strategy is going to be. And I think in the case that's being cited, the integration strategy there may well be a preservation strategy, with a later plan to integrate.
Yeah. Hopefully that's helpful. All right. let's keep moving on. I'm going to talk a little bit about sub-optimization. So in our industry, a classic kind of waterfall approach to doing integration work is considered a sub-optimized approach to doing this work. And when we talk about sub-optimization, we're meaning the integration of typically the technical elements of the operating model first, then the social system or people last. What comes to mind here is think of an airline industry acquiring another airline industry. When that was happening in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of airline consolidation going on and acquisition. The first thing that the airlines did typically were paint the planes, which would be a classic kind of technical first. The last thing they typically did was blend the people. So you still had, for years, many times, you had flight attendant teams and pilots completely from previous companies staying intact and not mixing and matching those. And they would rework the union contracts and the agreements, and that would be the last thing that they would do to integrate the unions, the contracts, the flight attendants, engineers, all those parts. It's a classic sub-optimized approach, what we call sub-optimized approach to integration or design. And it fragments the work stream, it implements technical changes first, and then you overlay change management, which basically, Peter's correct here in his comment, is it tells people in change, which is basically compliance-based change. What we advocate and what's buried and explicit in our model is what's called joint optimization. And that is basically the integration of the technical and the social system simultaneously. And what that basically looks like is an integrated approach that basically involves people and the social systems from both the acquirer and the acquiree actually being involved in setting up the new operating model, whatever that is. And it's basically using the technical changes as a vehicle or means of integrating people and readying people for the change and allowing them to work that through rather than waiting 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the line to do that work. So this is an important consideration for you that's also implied and expressed in our approach. Peter, do you want to take, these are the earlier slides that we had. I'm happy to take one or two if you want to, the previous slides that you mentioned early on.
Yeah. Just before we do that, a question from Joe Davison.
Yep.
What if you started org design in the acquiring company, but haven't done this work with the company being acquired? How do you ensure fit, alignment, and approach prior to transaction and integration? I'll let you take that one first.
Hi, Joe. It's good to see you. I'm going to go back to speed, right? Sometimes there are windows of opportunity that you have to move quickly on. And the key then would be, the key on this, and knowing what I know about your question is in a very quick window of time, is to bring the acquiree in, but not let it languish and leave it there, then do the design work as quickly as possible, not allowing it to languish or to go over the course of years. So in other words, if you need to move quickly, then bring it in, bring it close, do what you need to do. I would strongly recommend some fit predictor so that you know what the integration is going to entail. And if you're going to do a traditional approach, due diligence, and bring it in and acquire it, then as soon as you acquire it, I would do a current state review or fit predictor to make sure and to sense check the integration work and the integration strategy so once you bring it in. So if you can't do it before, do it as quickly as you can and then readjust your integration strategy before you start any integration. That's what I would say.
and the thing I would add to that is you need to think about what the impact on the people and the social system in the organisation will be, because they're already going through change, and then you announce that you're going to acquire a company, so they're going to see more change coming. So it's not just about making sure you get the technical bit right. You need to make sure that you are readying the people and the social system in the acquiring company for the change that's going to come as a result of acquiring another company. So it may be a case where you have to slow down. There maybe will be an argument for slowing down the organized design effort you've got going on in order to get the integration done. Because what you don't want to do is to finish your redesign and then say, aha, you thought we'd finished, but we're about to start again because we're going to integrate a company now. That's so right. It's another case, to use Mark's phrase, where it may well be better to go slow to go fast. So slow down a bit so that you can stabilize the future operating model more quickly.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Advantages, disadvantages, results. Anything you want to say here, Peter, before I make a few comments?
No, I think we're starting to build from. Hopefully, what we're helping everybody do is build a picture of what you can start to do to overcome some of the reasons that we know that mergers and acquisitions either fail to deliver long-term value or destroy value in the short term. So that's really just a repetition in the red of what not to do, because we've seen if that does happen, that underpins a lot of the failures to deliver value that we've seen. And I'll leave you, Mark, to present the good news in green.
Yeah, so building on the earlier slides that Peter went over in the beginning, that's the one thing I would say, and this is the hard part, is many of us, including us as consultants, are influencers, and we're not the deciders. So if you're if you're part of the internal change team, the key is to influence where you can and recognize you're not the decider. And so all you can do is inform, educate, provide choices, highlight things, and then recognize that in the end of the day, as an internal change agent, you're basically in a role of influencing, and you have to recognize that. And so you push and you impact where you can. However, I think these 5 considerations we've been building towards the whole time is, basically minimize your surprises, so know exactly what you're getting into. And when you get an early real view of what it takes to integrate, you'll have a more realistic integration strategy in terms of resources, time, effort. So that's number one. The conversation about how do we want to go about this integration process? Do we want to jointly optimize, or do we want to sub-optimize and take a sub-optimized approach to integration? Is a very important conversation for leaders, and they don't fully always appreciate that. And this is where the joint optimization, you can drive culture and behavior change simultaneously with the integration work, which is basically number 3. Change the culture, change the ways of working, build strong, cohesive relationships early on. That's the advantage of joint optimization, of doing it in a way that's more collaborative. Achieve synergies earlier by setting up the operating model once. So basically, get clear about what it is you're trying to do as an acquirer in terms of your own operating model. And then as you integrate into the new future operating model, and then move that into continuous improvement for all involved, but through a way that's done through joint optimization or very collaborative. And Peter and I, you've heard it from us both today once or twice, is, the wisdoms are here for us are pay now versus pay later. You'll pay more later when you take a sub-optimized approach or a more traditional approach to acquisition. And the other wisdom here is go slow to go fast. And what we mean by that is your implementation and your post integration, stabilization, and getting to business as usual is going to go way faster if you put the time in up front and do the work properly. Peter, you want to, anything you want to add on considerations, tips, and wisdoms?
I guess one or two things just to say on here. I'm having a look at the time. Yes, got a few minutes. I'm sure everybody on there can read the words, but just going back to the fit predictor and stepping back from it a second and pulling a couple of things together that we've covered. You use the OTM predictor up front as part of due diligence, but focus on both the strategic and the operational fit, because Mark and I, on another occasion, tell you great war stories about an M&A project we worked on where in simple terms, a customer intimate company acquired a product leading company, and that doesn't ring alarm bells for you, but it does tell you you've got a lot of work to do on the strategic fit before you move on to the operational fit. Because if you try and integrate an organization that thinks it's a product leader into an organization that wants to operate in a customer intimate way, then you're going to have problems on your hands later on. So it is worth spending the time on getting that real clarity around the strategic value proposition before you start moving on to the operational fit. And the other one, I'm sure you're all reading the words on here, the other one I would stress quite strongly on here, and Mark might come back to some others, is if you do the fit prediction, the fact that there's a low level of fit is not a reason not to proceed. All it is a reason to begin your holistic integration planning, planning the final operating model very early in the deal process. So, we don't want you to take away that the fit predictor is something that says go, no go. It's not a no go decider in the deal process. All it is an indicator of the amount of integration work you're going to have to do to get to a final operating model, because it'll indicate at all points of the OTM applied STAR model where the big deltas are, and where you need, the amount of work you're going to have to do to integrate the two organisations. So those are the two I would focus on. I know people are reading them all. I don't know if any others you want to pick out in detail, Mark.
I will, but before, I think number two, I think the critical point of number two that I would share is the bigger the gap between what the work that needs to be done to integrate, that translates into effort and costs and time. And this is what we mean by no surprises integration, which is if you have a really good idea of the acquirer and the acquiree in terms of strategic and operational fit, what you then can begin to do is say, this is what it's going to take to get us to that integration strategy. This is what it's going to take. And I think from that perspective, leaders can decide on budgets, on resources, and you can't magically just think that line leaders are going to integrate things, because we know from neuroscience that people default to what they know, because we're creatures of patterns, and our brains love patterns. So the wisdom of is that we default back to what we know. You can't just rely on a line leader or a set of line leaders to integrate things. You have to be able to say, what kind of support does the organization need to truly integrate based on whatever that integration strategy is, assuming one of those four positions that requires design. I always find the value customer proposition and the customer experience to be very eye-opening. So if you really want to get a sense of strategically and operationally how well the fit is become a customer of both organizations and use that customer experience to compare and contrast of when things go wrong, how do they treat their customers? How easy is it for things to get solved? So when we talk about a value proposition, we're also talking about the customer experience. And so that experience could be very similar or could be very different for an acquirer and an acquiree. Let's see here. Lastly, I think, well, I've already said this, is using the organization design approach to integration allows you to view things through a systemic lens, holistic and comprehensive, not just parts and pieces. And it's going to save you about 18 months to 2 years to 3 years out. It's going to save you time and effort. For example, a real simple example is the acquirer and the acquiree may be providing what on paper looks like similar services, but how they do it, the quality of that work, the value stream or the work processes behind delivering those services might be totally different. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to wait 3 years to fix that? So it's that kind of systems approach that you want to be thinking about way up front so that you're realistic about the integration. I'll be quiet there, Peter. Anything else I might have triggered for you, feel free to share that.
No, I think is it an opportunity to give an opportunity to give people a chance to ask some questions, or do you want to wrap out with the last couple of slides?
Yeah, I think let's go ahead. There's a new comment there. Maybe you can look at that while we go into kind of wrap up. And
no, it's not. It's just a comment, not a question. So we're
I gotcha. Yeah. So first of all, we thank you. We recognize your time is valuable, and we don't take for granted your participation in our webinars. Reagan said, I don't know if everyone saw it in the chat, this is being recorded. The slides will be made available. We appreciate you. You can certainly use our slides, just keep the On the Mark copyright on there. A couple of things that we want to highlight coming up is we have a masterclass information session coming up, I think next week, or whenever the 17th is, and we're going to have a OTM alumni there. Lindsay's going to join us from Victrex and talk about her experience of our training her in the masterclass previously. Peter and I have the honor to do that. We also have upcoming a neuroscience and shade webinar. I'm thinking Dan is doing that. We're going to have so Dan Schmitz, one of our team members, is going to be doing that, and excited about that, and you can sign up. We also have an OTM 5-week organization design virtual masterclass that starts the week of April 27th. And it is accredited by the organization design community, which can lead to your being certified as an organization design professional. Peter mentioned that early on. I also want to highlight that some of our professional organizations also have some master classes. Of course, we teach different content and more generic content, but the European Organization Design Forum has a master class coming up later, I think in April. Am I correct, Peter? Or when does that start?
There's one starting today, funnily enough, but there's also one starting in April. Yeah.
Right. We also do internal organization design courses for entire teams and project teams. And lastly, most importantly for us, is we're hiring. So get the word out. We're looking for a support consultant. And we're offering a $1,000 or 1,000 British sterling finder's fee for someone who can lead us to the ideal candidate. So, Peter, anything you want to add here?
I don't think so. I think unless there's any final questions, I think we've covered the bases.
Yeah, and you have a standing invitation to reach out to Peter or me, or to, if you have more questions. So we really, it's important for us to be a resource for our industry.